Alrighty, folks. So for this bit, I just want to give you a kind of general layout of the Trecento and what it was. Trecento just means 1300s in Italian. It was sort of a special time for Italy because you started getting composers and writers being really creative in their own native tongue, right? The Italian composers of the Trecento were kind of like late inheritors of the troubadour and trouvère tradition. So I talked about this earlier when we talked about the troubadours. That French tradition got into Spain a little bit with the cantigas, and then went north from the troubadours to the trouvères, and then east over to the minnezingers. But when we got to Italy, I just talked about the lauda, right, which was that sort of barely literate tradition that they had there. And the reason was because the audience, traditional audience for trouvère and troubadour music, or troubadour music especially, was the nobles, the elite, right? And the elite in Italy preferred their poetry in French. They didn't even really think you could write good poetry in Italian just because of the nature of the language. So it wasn't until in the 1300s, led by Dante, you start to see folks writing poetry in Italian. And poetry was almost always accompanied by music, so we start to see a secular musical tradition appear there as well. It was distinct, at first at least, from some of the French traditions that we've talked about. So, and one example of this is that in France, we saw right at the beginning of the 1300s the Ars Nova innovation in rhythm kick off. And the Italian tradition was kind of different because they had their own sort of alternative to the Ars Nova. And when I was talking about the piece by Petrus de la Cruz with the crazy number of semi-brevs in a brev, whether it was 2 or 9 or 7 or whatever it was, and how Cruce used the points of division to sort of mark off, how many semi-brevs were in a brev. That's kind of where the Italians started. They used that points of division idea. But instead of just using the points, what they would use is various note heads that could be filled in or not filled in, and then various stems that would come off the note heads, and then flags that could be put onto the stems. So, for example, that's some old stuff. For example, there was a kind of division called the octonaria. And it meant that the brev was divided into 8 notes, and it was basically represented by a note head with an ascending tail and a flag coming off of it. And that should look pretty familiar at this point, right? Looks like an 8th note. So it gets a lot more complicated than that, but that's the general idea. Instead of having these mensuration signs that we spent so much time talking about last week, they would use these symbols to indicate how you chop up the brev. And then, along with their own notation, they also had their own genres, which the textbook talks about. So, I mentioned that, Occitan, which is the language of the troubadours, was preferred for the high-minded, lofty, very fancy kind of poetry. And so Dante, who was kind of, like I said, leading the charge on this, sort of thought that, if complex music would only be a distraction from the words, and what Dante wanted was sort of poetry and words that lined up a little bit better. And so for Dante, the solution was for poetry in Italian to be a kind of middle ground poetry. Poetry that was literally mediocre, meaning middle of the pack, not bad, just in the middle, right? Poetry that wasn't so good that the music would take away from it, but also that it wouldn't outshine the music, where, both sides would kind of equally match. And the themes of the poetry that we're going to see in the next video fit this description. And there is actually a word for this kind of poetry that describes the countryside, that describes enjoying nature, that describes a different kind of love from the canso, which was a very distant love. The love in this kind of poetry is more earthy, more real, and they called this the locus amoenus, which just means the pleasant place, which is very, very nice. Okay, so in the next video, we will get started looking at the actual genres.